Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Chris Gorin. Taiwan has a new leader. Lai Ching-te has been sworn in as Taiwan's new president on May 20th. To discuss what Lai's presidency will bring, we have with us today Scott Simon, a professor from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and he's also the chair of Taiwan Studies there. Scott, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So you've been here basically since the beginning of democratization in Taiwan.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Great. Well, then that'll give you a great perspective on Lai Ching-te's most recent inauguration speech. I mean, when you listen to that speech, what are the main takeaways for you?
Yeah, I think that, I was just there. I think that the number one takeaway that I have is his hope that Taiwan is for the world and the world is for Taiwan. And so it's his hope that the world will recognize the importance of Taiwan for the well-being of the world. I think that one of the innovative things in his speech today was when he talked about Taiwan as being an ocean country and the need to develop the ocean resources. And that's one of the new things that he brought up today. He's not the first one to do that. One of the anthropologists at Academia Sinica a long time ago said Taiwan is an ocean country in contrast to China, which is a continental country. And they've recently created councils of ocean affairs. And so I think that this is something that he's very much interested in. Maybe that's because of his time in Tainan with the Taijiang Inner Sea, and that's the place where the Dutch and everybody came from overseas. So there's something new there that will probably develop in the years to come.
When you compare it to previous speeches by other presidents, and particularly Tsai Ing-wen, his predecessor, do you see any differences, commonalities?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that I would like to do later is sit down and count and try to look at the number of times that he mentions Taiwan and the number of times he says Republic of China. It seems to me that this particular speech was far more Taiwan-centric than the speeches have been in the past. I mean, we have to go back and read Chen Shui-bian's, for example. But it seems like the percentage of use of the word Taiwan rather than Republic of China seems to be quite high.
He did also mention early in his speech, he refers to, the Republic of China, Taiwan, as being a sovereign, independent country. And I do believe that it's the first time that the word independent has actually been used in an inaugural speech. It's been used in other speeches, but not during the inauguration. Do you think that that is significant, or do you think it represents kind of the status quo?
I think that represents the status quo, actually. And I'm just thinking back towards Tsai Ing-wen. I'm looking back to Ma Ying-jeou, just thinking about that. I think ever since Chen Shui-bian, really an emphasis on the sovereignty issue. And the question is whether they emphasize sovereignty of the ROC or ROC Taiwan or Taiwan. And I think that was also one of the main things of the speech today, because he said, no matter whether you call this country the Republic of China, the Republic of China, Taiwan, or Taiwan, we can all come together and support the sovereignty of this country. I think that was something very special about this speech.
So in your view, how do you expect China to react to what Lai said in his speech?
Well, I think that he, in the best of intentions and with sincerity, I think that he has tried to offer an olive branch to China and say that what we need, what our common interests are, is peace across the Taiwan Straits and prosperity. And he even talked about having tourism going across the straits. He referred to cross straits, Liang'an, right? So I think that he tried to give an olive branch to China. I think he wants there to be a peaceful relationship. He said neither will be subordinate to the other. That's language that Ma Ying-jeou has used, so it's got a long history. But he says we have to be realistic because he's also very aware of the fact that China's not that interested in having a peaceful relationship with Taiwan. China's interest is to annex Taiwan, which is anything but peaceful.
What about countries other than China? In several past speeches, positive relations with the United States and Japan have been mentioned. Japan was not mentioned in the speech, and the United States was, although it was not specifically about positive relations with the United States. So do you think that's significant, and how do you think those countries may interpret their mentioning or lack thereof?
The United States mention, I think, is something that really struck me as important, because he didn't just say we're having a good relationship with the United States. He actually spoke to a specific piece of American legislation and said that the United States has upped the ante on protecting the security and peace in the Taiwan Straits and the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that he may not have spoken at great length about either the United States or Japan. He's got a limited amount of time, and I think that he strategically pointed at the United States as being very important in the Indo-Pacific realm. And so it's kind of a way of saying to the United States, thank you for your support, and we would like, as Taiwan, to contribute to the peace and security of the Indo-Pacific.
Another interesting part of Lai's speech is that he mentioned Taiwan's diverse ethnic community, but he didn't actually name indigenous communities as such, which is a little bit of a departure from previous inauguration speeches. Given your background in studying the indigenous communities in Taiwan, did you find that to be significant, or what's your takeaway from that?
Well, the previous ones have talked about such things as the four ethnic groups, which are the indigenous peoples, and then the Bensangren, so the so-called native Taiwanese, and then the Waisangren, the mainlanders, and the Hakka. And I think that, like Chen Shui-bian, for example, he was even criticized for this, was using indigenous peoples to claim a non-Chinese identity for Taiwan. And it seems to me that Lai instead is trying to create a multicultural Taiwan, which doesn't specifically cultivate that non-Chinese identity, but rather tries to be embracing of all in a new way.
A kind of cosmopolitan Taiwan.
Yeah, because it's multiculturalism. And I think that maybe some indigenous rights activists will be disappointed with that. So the kind of people who this is grassroots indigenous activism. They're the kind of people who are in favor of greater recognition of indigenous peoples as tiny sovereign nations in their own right. We'll find that disappointing. But Chen Shui-bian is the one who liked to talk about that and didn't do much actually in terms of making that policy.
Speaking of indigenous policy, Lai is his first day in office, so maybe we don't know yet, but how do you feel that his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, has done on indigenous policies? And how do you anticipate that Lai will do so in his first term?
Yeah, well, we'll see what he does in his August 1st speech, when he does his Indigenous Day speech. I think that will be important to answer that question. Tsai Ing-wen began her indigenous policy on that date in 2016, and the first thing she did is apologize for 400 years of colonialism in Taiwan. And then she created the Presidential Office for Historical and Transitional Justice. And under that committee, and she was there for these meetings, and so was Lai, so we might see some continuity there. But they had regular meetings with a representative from each of the indigenous peoples in Taiwan. And they got to express their concerns, and I think that the government did their best to address them.
Are there any specific policies you'd like to see the Lai administration put into place in regards to indigenous communities?
Well, it's not my place necessarily to say what the priorities should be, but there was in 2005 the basic law on indigenous peoples, and there are parts of that which were easier to put into place. But there's an article which has two things in it. One of them is intellectual property rights. And so the indigenous peoples have the right to their intellectual property rights and such things as songs, dances, and weaving patterns and so forth. And then within that same article, it says that the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people should be protected. And there are other parts of it which require additional legislation. So one of the most obvious ones is that the law requires that some kind of autonomous governments be set up. And so I think that indigenous activists imagine that that would be like the band councils in Canada, some kind of a self-government regime. And that could be very difficult, I think, to create the law that satisfies the most people possible.
So when you say an article, what exactly do you mean? You mean like an article in an academic journal, or what do you mean?
What I mean is that the basic law on Indigenous peoples has a number of articles being a law. It's an important piece of legislation that happened. It has its history because in the 1990s, they made additional articles to the Republic of China Constitution. And one of them was in 1997, they said that Indigenous peoples have political, economic, and other rights. And then in 2005, the KMT-dominated legislature came up with a piece of legislation called the Basic Law on Indigenous Peoples. It begins with a definition of what does it mean to be an Indigenous people, what does it mean to be an Indigenous person. It addresses both discrimination against Indigenous individuals, but also collective rights. And so that's where it promises some kind of a self-government. And it says the relevant law will be written. And interestingly enough, the very end of the basic law says that this should all happen within a period of 8 years. Well, it hasn't happened yet. There's still a lot to be developed, but we can see that the legislative people are working on that. And so we had some rather contentious laws last time under Tsai Ing-wen, and I'm sure that there'll be things happening as we move forward.
Like what contentious laws under Tsai?
Well, under Tsai, they tried to have some kind of a law in which they would define traditional territory. And this is something that was important to some of the activists. They just took down their protest camp nearby the presidential office. It was in a park there. And that's been going on for 8 years. And basically that's because the law that was proposed was that the traditional territory would include state territory. And so they left out private property. And so those individuals that were protesting were very upset that it did not include private property. But that's one of those difficult compromises that politicians have to make.
So you are from Canada. When you look at the kind of policies for Indigenous communities in Canada, certainly not a perfect record, but do you think that there's anything that the Taiwanese government can learn from the kinds of policies that have been put in place for Indigenous communities in your country?
I think that in terms of really practical consideration, that each band is a legal person, which means they can enter into contracts. And so they are able to do all kinds of economic development projects for their communities that they control themselves and that benefit their people. And that's something that really can't happen in Taiwan until at some level there's a recognition that, and this has to be legally done, that these are legal persons that can sign contracts. And so how that's done is something that the legislators would have to figure out. So would it be that there are 16 officially recognized peoples, each one is a legal person? That's not what it is in Canada. Or would it be that each Indigenous community, and there are hundreds of them in Taiwan, would have the right to enter into contracts? And that would be more similar to the Canadian model.
Thanks so much, Scott, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. To find out more news about Taiwan, you can follow us on social media. Thanks again for joining, and see you next time.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.